We just got some major information about sirens in Borderlands 4, and it came from a slightly unexpected moment. In Borderlands 4, there are a ton of collectibles scattered across Kairos you can collect, from your traditional echo logs to deadbolts which tell you how people died, to RJ's guide to being a vault hunter. But the one most relevant to this video are the evocariums. These evocariums tell the story of Nereid and her early history with Kairos. These audio logs were one of the things I was most excited to learn more about when the game came out, because her return to the franchise was such an unexpected surprise considering she's dead. We heard what we thought at the time was her entire life story in Borderlands 3, meeting the Iridians and locking the Destroyer away in Pandora. She was literally the most fundamental character used to expand the lore of the Sirens, the Iridians, Guardians, and just a whole bunch of other different stuff that needed expanding. And at the end of it all, we heard as she locked herself in a vault to die. Which she did, because her powers then went on to become Tyrene's. So she was dead, so color me shocked to see her return again in yet another relevant part of her past. However, unlike in Borderlands 3, where her audio logs were so fundamental in understanding the universe, in this game they are a neat story. The evocariums aren't nearly as important as they were in Borderlands 3. That's not to say that her story on Kairos isn't interesting in and of itself. It is, but it is a very linear story. I'm not going to play all of the logs for you here, but I'll give you a quick rundown on what happens and cover all of the most interesting parts present. So basically, they're a diary of her life as she experienced it when she mysteriously wound up on Kairos. Her story starts off immediately interesting as how she wound up on Kairos she describes as having fallen through an arch.
I fell through the arch into a sea of green grass and warm breeze. There was no return portal. I don't think that's by accident. I could fool myself into thinking it was because no one would want to leave a paradise such as this. But a siren knows a cage when she sees one.
At the time, this was before she had met the Iridians, so she didn't know anything about them, but we know that what she's talking about is a vault. And what makes it interesting is how did a vault wind up teleporting her to Kairos? In modern day, pretty much every single character we encountered was either born on the planet or they had a ship that flew too close to it and it was pulled down, forcing them to crash land on the surface. But Nereid describes neither. It was a vault that seemingly just dropped her in the middle of this planet. And we're never given any further answers of how this was done or why it happened. Regardless, despite the planet's beautiful nature, she immediately recognizes it as a cage. The world is empty, there's no signs of human life, and she spends a lot of time exploring it. Being one of, if not the only human on the planet at the time, she is not struggling for food or water, but that also hardly matters because she is a leech and can leech life with her siren powers. Eventually though, after exploring much of the planet, she spots the Timekeeper watching her from a distance, and so she naturally assumes that he is her jailer and plans to escape the planet no matter what. She begins to collectively store as much power as possible, leeching the life of any animal, plant, and extra source of power she can get her hands on. Eventually, when the two come face to face, Nereid uses all of the power she gained to use the Timekeeper as a beacon to make herself known to her siren sister, who can then locate her and teleports her out of there. That's a very summarized version of the events because her journey isn't inherently what I want to talk about, but rather the smaller details within. Probably the single most important piece of information to come out of this is the new/old siren, Iris. If you listen to the way Nereid describes her and her power, then you'll notice it sounds very familiar.
Yesterday, I attempted something I have seen my more experienced siren sisters use to communicate. I opened my mind, called out to them. My hope was to reach Iris. I've seen her step from one planet to another in a moment and a flash of fire. Instead, I heard nothing but my own voice, rebounding, amplified to a scream.
By the sound of it, Iris originally had the Phase Walk ability before Lilith. Now, a couple months ago, this would have genuinely meant very little. Iris would have just been a siren of the past added to the list whose only notable trait was possessing the Phase Walk prior to Lilith. However, in August of 2025, our knowledge of sirens and how their powers work fundamentally changed. Originally, everyone thought that there were 6 siren powers, as there can only be 6 sirens in the universe, for now. Everyone thought the same went for their powers, that when one died, another would inherit that exact power. But on August 18th, 2025, Sam Winkler, the narrative director for Borderlands 3 and 4, tweeted out a bombshell that changed our understanding of sirens permanently. He wound up putting out that while there are only 6 available slots for sirens, there are theoretically an infinite number of powers that can emerge. So unless a siren chooses an heir to inherit their power, it's a toss-up however it may emerge. And that changes Iris entirely, because that means she went from just the siren that happened to have Lilith's powers before her, to the siren that chose Lilith to inherit her power. And that changes a lot. Lilith has slowly gained more and more relevance and importance to the universe as the games have gone on, but this is an entirely new layer, almost painting her as a potential chosen one. But now the question is, does this idea have any sort of credence or history to it? And the answer is actually kind of. The closest thing we have to any sort of potential background and history on this is actually the Borderlands origin comics. The origin comics have always been very take 'em or leave 'em. They were released throughout late 2012 and early 2013, and they told the, as you would expect, origin of the original 4 Vault Hunters. The reason I say they were take 'em or leave 'em is because while they expand the backstories of Roland, Lilith, Mordecai, and Brick, the games themselves have never gone further to solidify them, whether they be through mentioning anything that happened in them or even referencing the slightest detail. We almost never get any info on their past that the comics remain uncontested. The games never even threw in the slightest breadcrumb to these comics, so its canon nature has always been questionable. But at the same time, the comics don't outright do anything that wouldn't make sense in the story or do anything to betray the characters, so you're not missing out on anything if you don't know these stories. All of that is to say, in Lilith's origin story, we get the only view of her childhood we've ever had, specifically the moment she got her siren powers when an old lady only ever referred to as the eldest approaches her, moments after her father's death. She informs Lilith that she is a siren and she is her song. She mentions how Lilith is a seed, but senses great power in her. The eldest goes on to explain the basics of sirens to her, how she will cross paths with many others who may stand against her, and others whom she may find allies in, and potentially many others. The eldest states how she's been traveling since her birth just to be there in that moment, and how it's Lilith's choice to do with her life what she wants, and that sirens have no code, only their song, and it's her turn to sing it now. The eldest then falls over and dies, and her powers are transferred over to Lilith. The comic then cuts to modern day, where we see how life led her to getting into fights at bars. She heard Pandora was a place for opportunity, and that's what piqued her interest, and you know the rest. Again, I'm not saying that this character is Iris. However, it is the only source of reference that we possibly have as to who it possibly could be. Especially because the trend we've now seen between Iris and Lilith is how other sirens tend to revere them as the strongest of the sisterhood. And coincidentally, if someone is referred to as the eldest, you might expect them to have knowledge and experience that once made them the strongest of the sirens. She is easily one potential candidate. But then that brings up a potential other possibility that Iris was the 7th siren Nereid warned about. In some ways, it does make sense. Nereid warns of a 7th siren as her final message to the universe, and yet doesn't speak of them during her time with the Iridians, and she lost her sisterhood after helping them. So she must have known them prior to the Iridians. Lilith and Iris share the same power, and Lilith time and time again is always being described as some sort of walking calamity, someone who's going to bring an end to life, the universe, and possibly even reality. So many characters we encounter fear Lilith's very existence that they seek to prevent her from doing anything. And now a connection has been made between her and Iris is the only Siren Nereid has spoken of by name, someone she's clearly close with, someone she believes is the strongest and most capable Siren, someone with the potential to be a danger. And there would be some irony in the 7th Siren that we're never supposed to find having been the first Siren we ever met. However, being so close with Iris and having so much faith in her could also be exactly why she fears the 7th. If the 7th killed someone as powerful as Iris, it would give reason Nereid would similarly fear her, and that Lilith embodies the 7th. Either way, it's something to think about. However, there are always much simpler options that could be the case as well. It could be the simple answer of that Iris is Lilith's ancestor, that they come from the same bloodline, and that the power has always been passed down. When it comes to the parents of pretty much every single character, we've almost never gotten any background information on anyone's unless it is explicitly relevant to their story, like Handsome Jack with Angel, Gage with her father, or Nisha growing up under an abusive household. Unless it is relevant right off the bat, we almost never hear anything about anyone's family. So Iris being somehow related to Lilith is one of the simpler solutions. However, it doesn't exactly make the most sense because, using context clues, Iris was alive when Nereid was. Nereid was trapped on Kairos in a time when the planet was not inhabited, and in modern day, characters like Zadra talk about being alive for over 1,000 years. Nereid lived during the time of the Iridians, which went extinct thousands of years ago, and the Timekeeper has successfully been guarding his vault to immortality, so naturally surviving that long is just an implausible thought for Iris. So how does the Phase Walk ability last thousands of years without changing into a different power until it got to Lilith? And that thought is the hangup right now. That is, unless Sam Winkler's statement about Siren powers not changing unless passed down isn't true. And I fear that that's also a very plausible scenario because of the phase leech powers. Because if this is true, then back in Borderlands 3, it doesn't make sense for Tyreen to have inherited the phase leech. It makes sense that Tyreen got the Siren powers that Nereid had, but for it to have been the phase leech specifically no longer does, especially because Nereid was explicit in her desire to never have her powers transfer to another. She would have never chosen an heir to pass down her powers to. Even if she didn't have any idea that her powers wouldn't be the same, she would have never wanted an heir to the phase leech. So why did it pass on? And the thing is, even in her logs in Borderlands 4, there is a moment where she detects the Siren she inherited her powers from after leeching a tree of its life.
Imagine my surprise when, after leeching a sip of life from a great tree, I felt the warmth of a sister. Another Siren. One who had touched the very same tree, who had fed on the same life. But I'm here now, with the power that was hers. Which means she's gone. I have no doubt this world was her grave.
Now, it could be that she's speaking in a broader sense, but the way she worded it, how they touched the same tree, fed on the same life, specifically after leeching life from a tree, makes it sound like the Siren she inherited her powers from also had the phase leech. Now, an argument can be made that what she's saying is less literal and more broad, like the Siren didn't literally feed off the life of the tree like Nereid is doing by leeching it, but rather fed from like an apple or fruit from the tree. Or because they're on the same planet, they're having to eat food the planet provides. But it is just odd that she feels this prior Siren connection and only makes mention of it after leeching life from a tree. But even still, If you're able to write off this moment as not a direct transfer of siren powers being the same, it still doesn't make sense what happened with Tyreen inheriting the phase leech makes sense. So now, ironically, we're kind of where we were in the beginning, because now Vex has inherited neither Commandant Steel nor Tyreen's siren power, developing her own kind of siren abilities. And yet instances have occurred where powers have transferred and stayed the same without a direct choice of an heir. Personally, I believe they are setting up Lilith to be like the chosen siren, the most powerful one that's ever existed, and she's the linchpin to everything. I mean, the games themselves are already pushing that without the need of subtext. But the unfortunate part is that the math just isn't mathing. So now you have to wonder, did Iris pass her powers down to Lilith, or was it purely some coincidence like with what happened with Tyreen? But Iris is a name that you should keep in the back of your mind moving forward. But I want to know what you guys think. What do you think of Iris? Did she deliberately pass down her powers to Lilith, or was it all one big coincidence that they share the same powers? Any and all thoughts, be sure to let me know in the comments below. Subscribe for more Borderlands 4 content in the future, and until next time, I'll see you in the next video.